special session for you today that will focus on a number of different efforts going on throughout the city to prepare Seattle for climate change. We have representatives here from 3 different departments. We have Valerie Pacino from the Office of Sustainability and the Environment, Amy Labarge from Seattle Public Utilities, and Paul Fleming, also from Seattle Public Utilities. And we've put together here a session that we hope will touch on a couple of different themes for you. One is how these different departments are working with the climate science community to get our climate information needs met to be able to support management decisions with regard to adaptation. We'll also talk some about the different challenges and barriers that we face in terms of using the science within the real policies and processes that we have happening within our organizations. And we also hope to talk to you about some of the success stories in doing that. A third theme that we'll touch on are some different approaches to adaptation in terms of whether a department focuses more on doing an adaptation plan versus looking at specific actions that can be incorporated within current operations or policies. So more taking the strategy of mainstreaming climate change adaptation into what we already do. So we hope to give you kind of a diverse set of examples of what we're doing at the city. We're going to organize this by going through 4 presentations. And after each presentation, we'll just take a minute or 2 for a quick question specifically related to that presentation, and then we'll reserve about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of all the presentations and have all 4 of our speakers come back up to the panel, and we hope to have a chance to have some questions that might cut across the presentations that you've seen or bring about a little bit more discussion and dialogue on how we're approaching adaptation at the city. So I will start with the first presentation, and should I just go ahead and load that here? Yeah. I can find how to get to that. So I'm going to talk about some specific examples at Seattle City Light of how we are addressing climate change. And rather than giving you kind of a complete overview of what we're doing, what I've hoped to do with this presentation is to focus on some specific examples of where we've identified some priority impacts, and we're actually looking at what some adaptation actions would be in response to that. Seattle City Light is a hydropower company. We are a department of the city of Seattle, and we do generation, transmission, and distribution, so we have facilities related to all those roles. In terms of generation, we own and operate 2 hydroelectric projects. One is on the Pend Oreille River in northeastern Washington, and the other is on the Skagit River in the North Cascades. And I also want to mention that particularly around that project, we also have 2 communities where city employees live and operate the Skagit facility, which is otherwise surrounded by North Cascades National Park. In addition, we have a transmission system that's about 650 miles of transmission lines and towers, primarily in western Washington, that delivers energy to the city of Seattle. And then kind of within our distribution area, we have about 2,300 miles of distribution system, including lines and transformers and poles, and all of that distribution system brings power to about 400,000 residential and commercial customers within the city of Seattle and surrounding area. So at Seattle City Light, we are looking at the impacts of climate change throughout this system and identifying places where we may be vulnerable to climate change and what actions we could take to reduce those vulnerabilities. So I'm going to focus first on an example from generation. This is our Skagit hydroelectric project located at fairly high elevation in the North Cascades. And there's a number of impacts that we might be concerned about with the operation of this facility. It is not only used for generating hydropower, but there are multiple objectives to operating the facility, as you've probably heard at a number of different talks that focus on reservoirs and dams throughout the Northwest. It is operated for flood control, fish protection flows, hydroelectric power, and recreation, particularly on Ross Lake Reservoir. And so one of the concerns that we've noted is potential operations in August. And so I'm just going to focus on this as an example. In the month of August, it's fairly dry here in the Pacific Northwest. We receive very little rain. And it is during this month that we have two objectives. One is to maintain Ross Lake full pool for recreation on the lake. And the other objective is to maintain minimum flows below the project for Steelhead and Chinook. And we have found that there have been only a few years in the historical record where it has not been possible to meet both of those objectives. But as we move into the future, the question is how much more likely would it become that we wouldn't be able to meet both of those objectives in August as we have changes in the hydrology in this system. And one of the critical issues there is glaciers. If any of you went to the Glacier special session yesterday, you heard that there's quite a bit of research going on right now in this field. And the reason is because it's particularly important in this time frame. And that's true for Seattle City Light as well. One of the main watersheds that comes into the Skagit project is the Thunder Creek Basin, which is heavily glaciated. And we know a lot of the stream flow coming in during that August and early September period, a great portion of that is coming from glacial meltwater. And so we are essentially relying on that to meet those August objectives at this time. And so one of the questions we have is how long will that last? And I think as somebody put it yesterday, when do we have to start weaning ourselves off our dependence on glacial meltwater? So we're engaged with University of Washington Civil and Environmental Engineering to model that glacier runoff dynamics in the Skagit area, in the Skagit Basin, so we can get a sense of how that's going to change moving forward. So what would we do with that type of information? This comes to looking at some ways that we might mainstream adaptation into our operations. One thing that's important to note about our Skagit project is it is actually very dynamic operations right now. We do a lot of monitoring for stream flow, snowpack, fish populations, and we are operating that project very dynamically in response to what's happening on a daily and monthly basis so that we can meet multiple objectives. And so there's some opportunities to leverage that, our dynamic response to climatic variability in order to deal with some of the challenges that we face in the future. But we do have aspects of our operations that are based on historical flows. And although we update that with more information on historical flows, we are still mostly relying on what stream flow has been in the past as opposed to looking towards the future. We have done a couple of things at City Light to really start bringing climate change information into what we do. Before I was there, some work was done to bring climate change information into our integrated resource plan. This is a 20-year plan that the utility uses to look at the resources that we have and ability to meet customer demand. We have incorporated climate change information into that plan. And although we have looked at longer term, beyond 20-year horizons for climate change information, but we also update this plan every 2 years. So that becomes an opportunity to bring in new climate change information as different results emerge. And then our projects, if you're not familiar with this system, they operate with a federal license. And the terms of those licenses are set and can last for a number of years, 20, 40, or even 50-year licenses. And so as we go through a relicensing process for the Skagit project, we have an opportunity to look at future stream flows and how that might affect our ability to meet the current objectives that we manage for. So then moving on to our transmission system, I'll give you a little bit of an example from that. So at City Light, I've been looking at the ways in which our transmission system is affected by extreme weather events or weather in general. And so we looked at outages to the transmission and generation system associated with weather over the last 20 years. And basically, most of the colors up there you see in this pie graph relate to wind. Wind is the #1 cause of outages in the generation and transmission part of the system. And wind has come up a lot in the energy sector in terms of looking at resilience, particularly in response to hurricanes on the East Coast. So nationally, the energy sector has really focused on this notion of hardening and resilience in response to extreme weather after things like Hurricane Sandy. But the question is, whether changes in something like wind patterns is really that relevant for an electric utility on the West Coast. And so in looking at how vulnerable we are, particularly to wind patterns, then we realized that we needed to know more information specifically about how wind patterns might change in Western Washington to know if our vulnerability would increase. So we're working on a research project with Eric Salathe at University of Washington to look at some results from regional climate models to get an indication of whether we would see changes in the intensity of windstorms or the seasonal timing of windstorms, so we could start to look at ways that we might be able to make our transmission system more resilient to that. We also see that lightning is a big component of outage hours there. And so part of what Eric will also be doing is looking at changes in convective storm activity in Western Washington. And then you see kind of some small slices of that pie relate to wildfires and landslides. And I'll just give you a little bit of an example of that. So we could do something like this if we really wanted to be completely resilient. Most of these outages, I will say, relate to the interaction of weather with vegetation. And many utilities do something like this approach to be incredibly resilient to effects on their transmission line. You can see that there is a kind of a transmission line running through basically a grass field there. However, at Seattle City Light, we know that there are a lot of additional benefits to having other vegetation in our transmission line corridors, and so that's not really necessarily an approach that we're looking to do. And we need a little bit more of a nuanced way of managing to have the vegetation that we currently have. And so for wildfire, one of the things that we have looked at is our vulnerability to wildfire, particularly around the Skagit project, and those two communities that I mentioned that are right around the project where people live and work there. And so we have worked with the Skagit Conservation District to identify wildfire hazard risk to those communities. And this is something that they were doing kind of independent of the climate change and wildfire risk. But I saw this as an opportunity to say, okay, what risks are you currently managing for related to wildfire, and how can we bring climate change into that conversation to say, would you be doing anything differently to assess your risk and hazard, given that you know the likelihood of wildfire is likely to increase even in this area of Western Washington. And so one of the things that came out of that was this discussion that actually our city light fire crews are trained in structural fire response, but they actually don't have training in wildland fire response. So part of this was just thinking about how we're going to prepare for when one of these events happen, and maybe getting our crews to be more a part of the wildfire response so that they could work with the National Park Service and be sort of a more of an active player when it happens. And I think that was one of the biggest sort of discussion points to have with folks, is rather than managing as if we might have a fire, to start thinking about when we might have a fire in the North Cascades, and are we going to be prepared for what that would look like. And then another part of this, again, is the vegetation management, and looking at how we currently manage vegetation in our transmission lines, and are there opportunities there to be more prepared for wildfire. However, one of the things that we have to keep in mind, again, I said, is that there's these multiple objectives for our vegetation management, and also that we actually have fairly narrow right-of-ways, and most of the ownership around our right-of-ways is other landowners like DNR, Park Service, Forest Service. And so in order to really look at our vulnerability to wildfire, we need to be working with those partners and looking beyond just our lines, and how can we interact with them to look at our wildfire risk. And then lastly, I wanted to mention one other thing about landslides. In response to the Ozo landslide, we did have some heightened concern about landslides within Seattle City Light. This is a photo of our transmission tower. So those of you who are familiar with the area, you might know that the edge of the landslide basically ended at Seattle City Light's transmission line, and we suffered very little damage associated with that landslide, but it was very close to home and definitely raised people's attention. And one of the things is looking at our all hazard mitigation plan. So under FEMA, we do have a all hazards mitigation plan for Seattle City Light, and that identifies a number of natural hazards that we know that we are vulnerable to and some potential actions that we could take to mitigate those hazards. And landslides was identified in that plan. And as a result of this event, we are looking at the potential of getting FEMA mitigation funds to actually build some structural resistance within our transmission line to be more resilient to landslides. And one of the things that we can do is actually put in these towers that would essentially isolate the impacts of a landslide in places that we know are particularly prone to landslides. So again, this isn't necessarily directly related to climate change, because we still know that the information is somewhat limited in terms of actually being able to link landslide risk to climate change. However, sort of having just the discussion within City Light that yes, with increased precipitation and precipitation intensity, we may see more landslide risk, and thinking about, even how resilient are we to the current landslide risk. And so kind of bringing that climate change in as part of the discussion really raises the awareness that this is something that we might want to take action on. However, one of the things that did come up in the discussion was the fact that we really need cost-benefit analysis. So we know that we can't possibly engineer to be completely resilient to every landslide, because that would be extremely expensive. And so until we really understand how the likelihood of landslides are going to change, it becomes hard to do that cost-benefit analysis to know how much should we increase our resilience and what benefit are we going to get from that. And then for our distribution system, again, looking at customer hour outages related to weather, we see that those are primarily based on wind, or wind that coincides with heavy precipitation or ice. And so again, this was one of the things that we said, okay, we really need to know more about wind patterns and how we could respond to this vulnerability and if that's going to change. And we do have a lot of programs in place right now where we respond to just the climatic variability associated with wind and windstorms. We have a Wind Watch program that's done by the University of Washington that gives us alerts when we're going to have windstorms and the wind speeds, so that we can prepare our crews to be able to respond to those events. And so by working with Eric Salathe, we hope to be able to look at if we could leverage these existing tools that address the climatic variability to say if we see changes in, say, the seasonality, changes in the seasonality of wind, then we could start incorporating that into the way that we deal with the climatic variability. But the last thing I'll say about this is one of the barriers that we face is that we design to standards for things like wind and lightning that are based on international and national standards, and that's what we're responding to. And so really to take it upon ourselves as a utility to design above and beyond those standards would be voluntary. And we do know that a lot of those national and international standards do not address climate change right now. And so being a utility that's a little bit out in front on that is a little bit challenging at times to know how to do that. So with that, I will just take maybe one or two quick questions, and then we'll move on to our next speaker and save more questions for the end.
Yeah, those international and national standards, is City Light taking an active role in trying to improve those to incorporate climate?
That's certainly something that we would like to do. The Department of Energy is establishing a partnership of utilities throughout the country that are taking voluntary actions to increase or to look at climate change adaptations. And one of the things that we could potentially do with the Department of Energy is say, hey, this is the type of thing that is beyond the control of any one utility, and we need this to be kind of higher up in the process to take a look at this. Those standards are set by NERC, which is an international, I believe it's even a nonprofit, it's not actually a federal agency. And so yeah, I think as utilities come together with these concerns, we can start to articulate, hey, that this isn't something that any one utility can do on their own. Take one more quick.
Yeah, in relation to the Ross Lake Dam, you were saying that you've got dynamic operations which you can adjust to deal with your heating needs. Other than like adjusting how much water goes out of the dam, what can you do?
So what we do is we have a very active program in monitoring the fish life stages. So we manage for about 4 different fish species. And so we are, during their spawning, incubation, timing, we are out there monitoring exactly where they are in that process. And so then we can adjust the flows on a daily basis to respond to the timing of what the fish are doing, so that our fish protection is tailored to each season, and how that changes from year to year. So that's one of the things that we're actively doing. We also monitor stream temperature. And we do currently our intakes, where the water comes from into the Skagit River, is actually not off the top of the reservoir. It's fairly low in the reservoir, and because of that, we do affect the stream temperatures downstream, actually, in terms of making them colder. So that's another thing that we can monitor throughout the season. Okay, so I think I'm going to go to the next speaker now, who is Paul Fleming from Seattle Public Utilities. I will maybe put this up